Hello, this is chapter 21, Imperialism, Structures and Patterns, and we'll begin as usual with our framing the argument points. So the first point here is that the causes of the rise of European imperialism, which happens in the second half of the 19th century, so from 1850 onwards, and really gaining speed in the 1880s, include the network impacts of uneven industrialization. Remember, in the last class or a couple of classes ago, we looked at these maps of the world that show how industrialization spread, beginning in Britain in 1750, and it really wasn't until around the mid 19th century that other places started to catch up. But these other places were not evenly distributed throughout the world, predominantly Europe, US, rather than in Asia and Africa or South America. So the internal politics of industrial countries, what causes an industrialized country to think that getting a big colonial empire is a good idea. And these causes are capitalism, nationalism, and racism usually. And the cultural frame values through which industrial societies view the world, again, capitalism, industrialism, colonialism, racism, imperialism all sort of go together as a package. And the technological, organizational, cultural tools that allowed causes to be converted into empires. We'll pretty much look at this in the second part of my lecture today. And the patterns of economic and political exploitation that characterized imperial relations, what the reality on the ground was for those that suffered under empires. Okay, two patterns and principles. In the industrial world, as we've said many times before, wealth leads to power, whereas in the agrarian era, the formula was that power led to wealth. So this is one of those things that you can take to the bank. This is a concrete pattern that usually applies throughout most instances. And secondly, the reality of what people thought the world was like when they looked at it through their cultural frame really mattered as much as what reality actually was. So in order to be an imperialist, you had to look through your cultural frame and see your country as being vastly superior to another country, and therefore that other country would benefit from being taken over by you. Okay. So let's have a think about some of the primary source readings that you're going to do this week, beginning with Lenthieu's letter to Queen Victoria from 1839, and in expresses his opposition to the British illegal drug trade. It was illegal from the point of view of the Chinese, not necessarily from the point of view of the British. The British were in a position whereby they couldn't really force the Chinese to trade with them too much because the Chinese didn't really want anything from Britain. Their manufactured goods were shoddy compared to Chinese goods, etc. So what the British decided to do was find a product that they could persuade the Chinese to want, and they decided that this product should be opium. And so they grew opium in India and then flooded the Chinese market with it. This, obviously is not a good situation for any country to be in, to have its market flooded with illegal drugs. And so this letter is an appeal to the moral consciousness of Queen Victoria to knock it off, to stop sending illegal drugs to China. The appeal failed, and Britain went to war with China later that same year, and again in an attempt to force trade. And this was the first of two opium wars that Britain fought against China. The result was basically that they crippled the Chinese economy, and while China never became a colony of Britain, it was certainly heavily influenced by Britain. The second, this is sort of one of the results of the opium wars, and you see here are Chinese peasants digging up their dead to remove valuable items that they had buried them with. And these are a minority population within China. And as when China lost the Opium War to Britain, Britain wasn't just satisfied with winning the Opium War, it fined China for having participated in the war that Britain started. And the Chinese had to pay this fine in precious goods. And so the Chinese, looking at their own population, disproportionately then taxed the minorities within their own population to get the stuff from them to give to the British for this terrible payment for a war that Britain started over drugs. Okay, so this is what's going on here, and these poor peasants are digging up their relatives to get the precious goods so they can hand it over to this Chinese official at the bottom here, who can then hand it over to Britain. So we just need an example of, what was going on in this period and how horrible it was, even for countries that were not directly imperialized. And of course, matters become worse when Britain stops sailing around just in sail-powered, but actually harnesses the power of the Industrial Revolution, puts it onto steamships. Steamships are not dependent on the weather. They can get more places more regularly. And we also get this thing created at this time that imperialism reinforces itself with industrialization in several ways, but because these industrialized steamships need coal, they need to find friendly coaling stations throughout the world, which gives an extra impetus to imperialism, like a never-ending circle. So this is a map. I think I seem to have got my maps in the wrong order. Oh, go back to that one, sorry. Okay, so this is a map that basically shows imperialism, and we're going to continue to talk about our primary sources now. So Jules Ferry, this is source 21.2a, is a ardent supporter of imperialism, French imperialism, and this is a record of speech that he made before the French National Assembly. Okay, so he's encouraging France to grab colonies, and one of his reasons is that France has just lost a very costly war within Europe against the Germans, the Franco-Prussian War. And, so France is smarting a little bit after this defeat, and so people like Jules Ferry were casting around against this background of nationalism and social Darwinism and saying, how can we have been beaten? We are the best. Biologically speaking, the French race, and they use this word race to describe different European countries, is best. So how can France prove it the best? Well, we can go and get a big empire, and this is what they do. And they take much of North Africa and West Africa, and of course Indochina as well. Okay, so Ferry in this is encouraging imperial expansion, but note that there is a persuading tone in this. There are some people who obviously don't agree, so he has to convince them. Then the next source that we read is Rudyard Kipling's famous poem White Man's Burden. And Rudyard Kipling himself was a child of colonialism. He was born in British India here, and went back to England for education, came back here when he was 16, and then travelled around various British colonies after that. The circumstances of the writing of White Man's Burden is when the US was fighting a war in the Philippines, and to try and encourage the US to become good colonizers in their own right and to expand imperialistically into the Philippines. And he reflects in this poem on what he sees as the responsibilities of being a colonial power. And he likens it to being a good parent to unruly and half-civilized children. It's a very offensive poem. You're supposed to, as a modern person thinking in the 21st century, be sort of horrified by his sort of casual tone of talking about non-white peoples as, half-sullen, half-wild children. But think about the circumstances in which it was written, and it's, you can see what he's trying to express and try to understand it as a product of the time, rather and get over your abhorrence of what it says. And our next two sources come from within British India. The first, Ramun Ray's 1823 letter to Lord Amherst. And in this, he's talking about some of the problems that India is facing, but trying to very much work within this British system. He was a big proponent of the British system of education, amongst other things, while equally campaigning against some of the traditional practices in India, such as the burning of widows or child marriage. So you can see that Ray somehow has a foot in either world in the past, in his Indian roots, and also in what he sees as being a British future. The next source, Dabadi Naroji, on commerce in India. And he's sort of an outsider even within India, as he's a Zoroastrian of Persian descent who's moved into India. His family had probably quite a while ago. And he's a political reformer. He established the East India Association so that he could inform British people more clearly what Indians were like. And obviously this was something that needed to be done when we look at a poem like White Man's Burden, and to educate the British public about Indian culture, and that the Indians were not savages. They had this long historical and rich culture. But he was also sort of one of these Indians that had a foot in Britain and a foot in India, because he moved to Britain, established a business in Britain. He was therefore the first Indian business owner in Britain, and we have many, many more. But Indians form a large minority of the British population now, and he even became a British MP. But he was not uncritical of British policies, and he talks in here and in this account about how the Britain is draining the Indian economy and not allowing the Indian economy to flourish. So our next source comes from both America and Central Africa in the Congo, and is directed to Belgium. Okay, so we've shown a real global link here. This is written by George Washington Williams in 1890, and it's a letter to an open letter to King Leopold II of Belgium. George Washington Williams was a free black American minister who fought for the Union in the Civil War, went on to become a member of the first black member of the Ohio State Legislature. And then he traveled to the Congo and was absolutely horrified. This is the Congo here in yellow, by the conditions he saw here. Belgium came very late to the scramble for Africa, this race for, to establish colonies in Africa, and in some ways they were, of all the cruel colonial regimes in Africa, the Belgian Congo was in many ways the worst. So some of the worst excesses of colonialism. For example, they would, one of the things they wanted was rubber. And rubber is not that easy to gather. You have to go deep into the jungle, climb high trees and tap them for the source of rubber, collect it and bring it back. It's dangerous, it's horrible work. It takes the collectors outside of the village environment completely. So what they would do is they would hold women and children hostage. They would hack off limbs from children to persuade their fathers to go out. If people ran away, they would be murdered, and the colonial soldiers would collect hands, for example, and that's how they would get paid for the number of runaway Congolese that they had caught. So it was a very, very, very brutal regime. And there's a great book called King Leopold's Ghost if you're interested in reading more about this barbaric regime in the Congo. Because Belgium isn't usually the first country that comes to mind when people think about imperial powers. Okay. So that's the last of our sources. Let's move on now. And this is the map of the world. and the division of it between early industrial empires. And you can see that Britain and France, Germany, Portugal, Spain, Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Italy, etc., have sort of bought into this colonial dictate. Okay, so let's have a think about why this would happen. Let's think about it intellectually. Why Europeans would suddenly decide it was a good idea to go and get colonies. And I'm going to leave this picture of Nietzsche up here for you as sort of a background to this. And it really is this imperialist moment in world history. This is not a long-term trend. Britain has a big colony, but it's not really a sort of inevitability in any way. And hopefully by the end of this, any ideas that you have about humanity's progress will be kind of eradicated too. So industrialization provides the economic, social, political and cultural effects that we've outlined in the last two chapters. The British origin of industrialization and then the uneven spread create the conditions for imperialism. They create these European conditions. But these conditions were not inevitable. They were not permanent. They were in many ways anomalous to world history. And many people are now starting to think about the last 200 years of world history as something of a hiccup, that something went a little wrong, and now the world is on a course correction, for example, with the re-emergence of China and India as world superpowers, which they've always traditionally been. So what happens is that the newfound opportunity that industrialization provides isn't used responsibly, and this is where Nietzsche comes in, that we can get the impression that what the Europeans does really isn't that well thought out. Well, it's not well thought out because this moment in time, this imperialist moment in time, hasn't really happened before when there's been such a profound technological difference and wealth difference. So when we last looked at empires, we'd seen these few empires of Spain and Portugal, and they've gone. The Spanish Latin America has gained its independence from Europe by this point in time. Britain has lost the USA, has pushed France out of Canada and consolidated its hold on India, and through the auspices of this privately owned East India Company. So Britain still has something of an empire, but it's not vast. In 1857, there's a rebellion, a mutiny of the Indian troops of the British East India Company, and Britain responds by clamping down in India very harshly, and the British then start to directly rule India. After 1850, as industrialization spreads, so does competition, and the European powers wanted more and more and more. It's a very greedy, childish land grab. And in 1855, there's a conference in Berlin that virtually just kind of lays out a map of Africa and carves it up between different European powers. And the Europeans now actually have the technology that allowed them then to go take these parts and establish direct rule in these places, because they have the railways, the steamboats, the Gatling guns, and the medicines that are going to allow them to survive in African climates such as quinine. So the causes of imperialism, we can think about them in terms of network dynamics and hierarchies and cultural dynamics, the last being significantly the most important. There are no new network connections in this period, or very few network connections, but what we get is a re-emphasis on old ones. These hierarchies, beginning with Britain, use the power of industry to spread the expansionist tendencies of capitalism. We just have to witness the Opium War to see this. What were the British interested in China? Not necessarily in selling them drugs, but in selling them anything. so that they could even up the market a little bit, because Britain did want Chinese goods. So the industrial powers needed these networks, and they thought they needed them to sell their products. Okay, so Britain, for example, is manufacturing tons of cheap product, but they want colonies in which to sell these products. There's not enough market at home. This is what they think is going on. But this is not really a need, because very few people in the colonized places could afford their products. So this is kind of a sort of self-delusion in some ways. It's perceiving the needs of the network, hierarchy, management, that they are going to make profits at this, but it's not actually the reality. And this is one of our patterns and principles, that reality doesn't match what is thought and what justifications really are, but what is thought is often more important. So we move on then to the needs of hierarchy dynamics. There is this one non-cultural factor, which is this need for coaling stations to refuel these steamboats, as we've said. And these, it's important, but it is actually like a self-perpetuating circle. We need to take this colony because we need to get coal to establish our steamboat. Okay, so you've got that. Okay, so we need the next one so we can send our steamboat a little bit further. And at the same time, it's turning into a bit of a land grab around the world. But when it comes to colonization, it's really the cultural dynamics that are to the fore. You'll have read the poem, White Man's Burden. This really emphasizes the idea that inferior races need to be helped by superior ones. And this is, of course, leads to our second justification, which is just out and out racism, that non-Europeans are incapable of ruling themselves and they need to be taught civilized ways. They need to be brought up to speed. They need to be modernized, by which we mean westernized, by which we mean Christianized. And that leads to our third justification, Christian missionaries. Okay, so this is kind of a bit ambiguous, and it can still be ambiguously interpreted depending on your point of view currently. Converting people to your religion is not necessarily a good thing. It's still very politically emotive, and there's many Islamic countries around the world today that really don't take too kindly to Christian missionaries turning up. But in terms of the 19th century, the Protestants thought that they needed to catch up a little bit. In the sort of early colonial period, it certainly was the Catholics who had won out in the war for souls, taking and converting most of South and Central America. And so by the late 19th century, it was very much the Protestants that went out to Asia and Africa, although there was still a Catholic presence. And in some ways you can look at what they did as quite benign. They brought medicine and education with them. But these people were racists. And because everyone at that time was racist, it was very hard to find it would have been very, very hard to find somebody who could even conceive of the world without this sort of idea of white supremacy. And so racist views were very much caught up with civilizational views. We need to go out and civilize these people. And again, some of this missionary ideas are still current. Not that everyone in Europe believed that imperialism was a good idea, but nearly everyone in Europe was capitalist, nationalist, racist. And the opposition to this came from the opposite ends of the political spectrum. Conservatives questioned the costs of this and thought that the impetus of national spending should be within the nation itself. And socialists asserted the universality of the rights of man, freedom, equality, liberty, and saw that colonialism was stamping all over these. But then again, we have voices like Jules Ferry, who were probably expressing the predominant voice in this period when he said superior races have rights over inferior races. Okay, so this is what's going on intellectually in this period, which supports the move towards imperialism.